you can get your hands on some pretty fresh and very delicious oysters pretty much any time throughout the year now. But that wasn't always the case because traditionally there was a season for oysters, and that occurred during what we call the R months. So those are the months that have an R in the name. We're talking fall through early spring.
Yeah, and it's the colder weather. So whenever it's snowy outside, you want to be inside and warm, and you want to make a stew.
Yeah. So all that together made it pretty easy for us to decide what we were going to make this month for our featured recipe.
Yeah, that's oyster stew.
Oyster stew. It's perfect. Even though we don't get oysters from West Virginia, they've still been really popular in local food culture here, going back, I would say, late 1800s or so. And since they were only available for such a limited time throughout the year, they became this really seasonal treat. You know, people would develop a lot of wintertime traditions, a lot of holiday meals and traditions around oysters. And there were these big communal oyster suppers, oyster picnics that were held in places like Lost Creek and other communities in north central West Virginia, particularly towns that were railroad towns. You know, the B&O, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, it gave people here pretty easy access to fresh oysters that came straight from the coast. And I first heard about that, I think, from your family.
Yeah, my family has a lot of stories about the oyster trains coming in during the R months of the year. Mm-hmm. My aunt and my mom specifically, when they were kids about 70 or so years ago, not to tell their age, but they talk about how somebody from the community would go and wait in the cold weather for the train to arrive, and they would get the oysters fresh off the train. They were packed in ice, and then they would actually deliver them into the local community. And to this day, my mom still makes oysters, usually between Christmas and New Year's.
Yep. So one of the funniest recurring themes that we've seen in the local oyster lore here is this steady complaint about oyster stews that don't have enough oysters in them. And sometimes these recipes would even become known as dishonest oyster stews. You know, it's kind of like, how could you honestly say this is an oyster stew? It barely has any oysters in it. You know, you can't even detect them. You can't taste them. And I think a lot of that was just these home cooks that would kind of give each other a hard time. You know, it's mostly in jest. But there were other times, like we have a restaurant advertised an oyster stew, and that stew ended up kind of skimping on the oysters. They might get called out in the newspapers.
A big scandal.
Yeah, a big scandal. And one of my favorite stories is from, you know, local churches, local clergy. They would use oyster stew to guilt their congregations into donating more money. So this is from Fairmont, 1913. If every member of our church would obey that one law of God and give his tithe, our treasuries would be filled to overflowing. We would not have to give those oyster suppers where they serve thin oyster stew, a bucket of stew with 3 oysters in it, and one oyster says to the other 2, "What's the use of all of us being here anyway? If you want to have a big revival in Fairmont, we must get away from our stinginess."
A lot of the common oyster stew recipes from that time, kind of the turn of the last century, were very simple.
Very simple.
Yeah, the simplest one was just 2 ingredients, just milk and oysters.
Mm-hmm.
We've adapted the recipes a little bit. We've made ours a little bit more complex, a little bit fresher, and we really love it.
It's really good.
Yeah.
It's pretty flavorful, and most importantly, it is honest. So it's full of oysters.
Yeah.
That's what I mean.
We try to keep it really honest. And we enjoy hearing and sharing the family stories and the local stories about our month oysters.
Yeah.
We think it's infinitely interesting, and so it's something that we really wanted to share.
Let's do it. Hey there, everybody. Welcome back. It is so good to see you again. It's a cold and snowy day outside, but it's nice and toasty here in the Lost Creek Farm kitchen. A perfect day to be making some stew, huh?
Yeah, we're making an oyster stew today, which is a local winter favorite.
Yeah, it's kind of our spin on an old classic. So this recipe, compared to some of the recipes we've shared in the past, is a little bit more involved, a lot of steps, so we're not going to waste any time. We're going to get right into it. Why don't we go ahead and talk about the ingredients that we need, huh?
Yeah, sure. So first thing you'll want is about 1.5 pints or 3 cups of milk. You could also use half and half if you want kind of a richer, fuller broth. You'll want about 4 tablespoons of butter. Here we have it split into 2 parts because we'll be using them in 2 different places. You want a medium-sized yellow onion. We have it already diced here. You want a medium to large shallot. We have it minced. About 1/4 cup of parsley, fresh parsley. We use the curly because that's what we had growing in the garden, but flat parsley would work fine as well. You want to have at least a few tablespoons of salt. You probably won't use that much, but you'll salt it to taste, so you always want to have plenty. We have a coarse kosher salt here. You'll also want about 1 tablespoon of fresh ground or coarse ground black pepper, and then 1/4 teaspoon of cayenne pepper for a little bit of a kick. Also, you'll need about 2 medium-sized potatoes, and then you'll want a medium-sized fennel bulb. And if you get any of this, you'll probably get some of this nice green fronds on it, and you can set that aside. We'll mostly use the bulb in the soup, but you can use some of this greenery for garnish at the end. You'll need 2 really big celery stalks, but we have 3 because they were a little bit smaller. But altogether, you'll need about 1.5 cups of each celery and fennel.
And we're also going to need a little bit of garlic. We use around 3-4 cloves of garlic, and we like to brown it in some butter first. Right? That is really good for this soup because it adds a layer of flavor to the garlic, which adds more depth to the soup itself, and then it gives us a nice brown butter that's infused with that garlic flavor that we're going to use to garnish the soup at the end. And that does it for most of the ingredients, except for arguably the most important ingredient, right? These are the oysters, and we're going to talk more about those in just a second. But first, because we have some steps to get through, let's go ahead and get started prepping our vegetables. First things first, we need to prep these potatoes. We're going to cube those down into about 1/2 inch cubes or so. And we've got a little pot of water that we're going to bring to a boil to cook those potatoes, and we'll use those in a later step. And while Amy is getting these potatoes ready, I just want to quickly say that these videos we make are made possible by our supporters on Patreon. And when you sign up to support us at the $10 level or more, we send you one of these cards every month. This is a recipe card that coincides with this featured recipe video. If you've already signed up to support us on Patreon, you probably already have this in the mail. If not, we would totally appreciate your support, and we'll provide a link to our Patreon page in the description of this video. So thanks, all you Patreon supporters.
Yeah,
we
thank you so
really
much.
appreciate it. And let's talk a little bit about the equipment we're going to need, because for this recipe you don't need too much. You know, you're going to need your sharp knife, your cutting board, your pot to cook your potatoes, and your soup, of course. But for the oysters, you do need a couple things. If you're using these oysters in the shell, especially, you're going to need an oyster knife. This is a special piece of equipment. It's unlike a standard kitchen knife in that the blade is very dull, but it's rigid. It's really tough, so it's what we use to pry those oysters open if we're using the oysters in the shell. Now, you don't have to use the oysters in the shell. It's an option. It's a good option for the freshest oysters, but a perfectly fine option is to use these oysters that are pre-packaged in a jar. In some cases, you may totally find that preferable for a few reasons. One of them is that it just saves the labor of shelling out your oysters. But whether you're using oysters in the shell or jarred oysters, you're going to want to have a way to drain those, because part of our goal in working with these oysters is to save the liquor or the juices that are either in the shell or in the jar. That's going to flavor our soup. So I use a strainer that sits on top of a small to medium mixing bowl, and that works pretty well. And we can show you how we work with those fresh oysters here in just a second, but I think right now we're ready to cook those potatoes up, huh?
Yep.
Okay. So our water is nice and hot. We'll just go ahead and drop those in. Okay, and we want to go ahead and add a little bit of salt to that water to go ahead and flavor those potatoes.
Add about a teaspoon and a half.
Now at this point we can go ahead and work up our celery and our fennel. How are we chopping these today?
Pretty much just a coarse chop, like a 1/4 inch.
And while Amy is cutting up that celery and that fennel, let's go ahead and talk about these fresh oysters. If that's what you want to use, there are a couple of things to keep in mind here. First of all, you want your oysters, you want to look at them, you want to make sure they're clean. Sometimes you get them and they've got a bunch of sand, a bunch of dirt, easy enough to take care of. You can rinse that off. Sometimes you need a little brush, but these are pretty well cleaned up for us. Another thing you're going to need that I forgot to mention earlier is something to protect your hand. What I use is a kitchen towel that I sort of roll up a few times over, and I'll put that down on the table. That way when I use my knife, I can be pretty sure that I'm going to protect my hand if the knife slips. Okay, so we look for a couple things in an oyster shell when we're shucking. The first thing we look for is this kind of narrow end, because that's where we start with our knife when we start to open it up. And there's a little space where the blade might fit right in. Sometimes it fits better than others. We call that the hinge. That's always where we start. The other thing that we look for is to find the top and the bottom. The top side should be nice and flat, and then the bottom is going to be pretty rounded, more so than the top, and it'll kind of rock back and forth when you set it down on the table. When we put the oyster down on our towel, to use that bottom rounded side to be able to point that narrow end up. That way I can just put that blade in. Being really careful not to force anything here. I just want to kind of slowly wiggle the blade into that hinge. And this is good because I can already see how that shell is opening up. And once it's pretty well free, I want to slide my blade just under this top shell where it's flat. I'm trying to separate right about there. There's this muscle that connects the oyster to that top shell, and I want to just slide through and separate that out. Came off nice and clean. Now what I'm trying to also do here is to keep this oyster really flat as I make that motion with my knife, because again, we want to save the liquid that's inside that shell. I want to look and see if there's any debris. There might be a little bit of shell debris. So another thing to keep in mind after you've pried it open a little bit is right there at the hinge where you've done your work, you'll probably have a little bit of debris, a little bit of broken shell, whatnot. You can kind of tip that down before you open your oyster. Get rid of that debris so you don't risk getting it inside of your oyster. With the oyster intact, with the liquid there, I'm just going to take my knife again. There's another muscle on the bottom just like there was on that top. And I want to try to separate that out. Drop it right in my strainer. Now I wanted to show you how to do that in case you want to work with fresh oysters, or maybe that's your only option. But again, another great option if you're making oyster stew is to use these pre-packaged oysters that come in these jars. These are already packed in a lot of juices, the liquor that comes with the shell, also some water. all of that is really great flavor for the soup. So if we're using these, it's simple enough to just pour that whole jar into our strainer and just let it drain as we're prepping all of our other ingredients for the soup. Now, a couple notes about these prepackaged oysters. If you get them, one thing that's kind of nice is they tell you where they came from. They also have a date on them, so that's a pretty good indicator of freshness. And they'll also have an indicator of the size. Now, some of them will say frying size, which are these big oysters, which we love to get for frying oysters because fried oysters are good. But for this, we want the ones that say stewing size. Those are a little bit smaller. And they'll have about 18, 20 oysters per jar, which is the perfect amount for this stew. Kind of a lot of work to shuck 18 to 20 oysters for this stew. So, you know, it's about the same price and a lot less labor. So, you know, no shame at all in using these oysters. They're pretty good for this. All right.
Okay, I'm done chopping, and I think the potatoes are done as well.
Okay, let's check those potatoes. What we wanted in the potatoes is not for them to be super soft. We just want them to be a little bit fork tender because we're going to continue to cook them a little bit longer in the soup later on. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that?
These look pretty good.
Pretty good. Okay. Well, let's drain those potatoes and we'll set them aside. And in the meantime, we'll go ahead and get the base of our soup ready. So you could use that pot that you cooked your potatoes in if you want. We're going to use something a little bit bigger. And we're going to start off here by melting 2 tablespoons of our butter that we're going to cook our vegetables in. And I think we're ready to go ahead and put our veggies in.
Okay. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and throw in the onion as well.
We're just going to stir these veggies around, make sure they're all pretty well evenly coated with that butter that we've melted. And as we're cooking these vegetables, we also want to season them. So all these spices that we laid out before, we want to put our coarse black pepper in.
Our 1/4 teaspoon of cayenne.
Yep.
And then about a teaspoon of salt right now.
And I want to keep an eye, especially on the onions here. That'll tell me when we're ready to add everything else. We want the onions to be pretty soft and translucent, not quite brown. So we'll let those hang out for a few minutes and come right back to them, huh? All right, so we are back after about, maybe say 4 or 5 minutes or so. And everything's looking really good. Those onions are right where we want them. You can take a look here, see how they're nice and soft. And we can also smell all of those spices really opening up, that black pepper, that cayenne pepper.
Yeah, it's smelling really good.
It smells really good. And at this point, we're ready to add our shallots and our garlic. Now, we wait until the onions are cooked to this extent. You can go ahead and put those in, yeah. Because they don't need as much time to get soft and brown.
And now that we've got the shallots in, we can go ahead and add this garlic.
And again, I'm just stirring to make sure everything's pretty well coated. At this point, you might find that you need a little bit more butter, which is totally fine to add a little bit more butter. We have some, you know, we plan to add half the butter at a later stage, but if you need to use a little bit of that to cook your vegetables, that's totally a-okay. I'm just going to turn the heat down a little bit.
And so those shallots and garlic should only take a couple minutes, right?
Yeah. We want kind of everything, the shallots and the onions, to be browning a little bit at about the same time. You can really smell that butter too, and that's really nice. You know, I think in this recipe it's good to sort of splurge a little bit and buy the good butter if you have some that you really like. You know, the butter just shows up in so many ways in this recipe. You know, we have butters that we use for sort of utilitarian purposes that we don't count on the flavor as much. But in this one, you know, I love to use a good butter because you can really taste the quality of it in your vegetables and the soup and that brown butter we're going to use as a garnish. So we have some nice salted, cultured butter that we're using today. All right, so I think we can call this good on our veggies, huh? Looks pretty good. We've got a little bit of browning, not too much, but it's enough. And I think at this point we're ready for our next step. So that's to add the potatoes. These are those pre-cooked potatoes that we've set aside. Just go ahead and put those right in there. And then we'll add our milk. Then we want to go ahead and add the rest of our butter. Let that melt into this soup base. Okay, and we're going to bring this all up to simmer. Medium to low heat is good. All right, we're going to add our broth, our liquor from the oysters themselves. Now, you can see those oysters have been draining pretty well. So we have probably, I would say 3/4 a cup, almost a cup of liquor from the oysters. That's good. You want at least half cup or so to get some nice flavor. So we'll go ahead and put that in there now. Okay. Don't get that much liquor from your oysters and you want more of that kind of seafoody flavor, there's another option.
It's a little bit of a cheat.
A little bit of a cheat, but you know, it works. You can buy this clam juice at the grocery store. Same section as all your canned tuna, your tin fish and everything. You know, we got lucky. We got a lot of nice broth from the oysters, but sometimes your oysters, especially if you're using them in the shell, don't come with that much liquor. And you want a little bit more shellfishy flavor. And being pretty careful to lightly stir here at this step. Anytime we're heating milk up, I try to do this because what I don't want is for that milk to stick to the bottom, to get overheated and get scorched. All right, so we've got a little simmer going on here. You can see it maybe steaming a little bit. I don't know if you can see that from the camera or not, but we're ready to put our oysters in. We've got everything warm enough to do that. We're just gonna drop these in. You can dump them all in if you want to, but one thing that's kind of fun to do is to put them in one by one. You know, that way you get to count them to know exactly how many you have, and you know, you divvy them up when you serve the soup, so nobody's getting cheated out of your honest oysters here. They should only take a couple minutes to cook. We're also going to add that fresh parsley. Mm-hmm. We don't want that to cook for very long either, because we want to retain a lot of that freshness.
And it makes the stew really pretty.
Yeah,
it's got that
beautiful
fresh
green.
bright green.
If you want to at this point, like if you have a bunch of leaves on your fennel, if you wanted to chop those up and put them in your soup, this would be a good time to do so. We're going to actually use some as garnish, as fresh garnish.
I have some
later
extra. You
on.
want me to chop this up?
Yeah, if we've got some extras. I love the fennel flavor, so I don't mind some extra fennel in here at all. Okay.
All right.
That looks pretty, huh?
Add some of that in.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Okay.
They're starting to look done.
They are starting to look done. Okay, and what we look for when the oysters are done is something we call the curl. And what I'm talking about there is on the outside of the oyster. You don't see them when they're raw, but there are these little sort of ridges, if you will, that curl up. I want to show you what that looks like. This is a pretty good one right here. You can see kind of how those outside edges are Pretty curly, pretty pronounced. All of them are looking pretty much like this now. And this looks very good at this point. Beautiful, it smells great, and I think we're ready to chow down, huh?
Yeah, I'll go grab us some bowls.
Okay. Last thing I'm gonna do to get ready for this is to just taste it. See if we need any more salt. I think that's great. We're gonna call it good on that. You know, sometimes it seems like we need more salt, but sometimes the liquor from the oysters is pretty briny. You know, that nice salted butter is coming through. I think that's great. Here, why don't you give it a taste, see what you think. Pretty spot on, huh?
Yep.
Okay, let's plate these guys up.
Alright.
Beautiful.
Alright, you want to dress these up?
Yeah, so what we're gonna do is use that brown butter that I talked about earlier that's infused with that garlic. It's in this little skillet here. Beautiful stuff. We always like to think about things that we can add to a super stew when we make it. Sometimes with this one we add some salty chopped ham if we feel like it needs a little bit of salt, but you know, this version is really great because it's got sweetness from the onions, from the fennel, it's got the saltiness from the butter, the brine from the oysters, the sort of creaminess from the milk and everything, and then of course this brightness that Amy's putting on it right now with these fresh fennel leaves just is a great little last touch. All right, looking good. Spoon for me, thank you. So that's it, everybody. This is our honest oyster stew, and it is honestly pretty darn good.
It's good.
Cannot wait for you guys to try this one. If you do so, take some pictures and tag us on Facebook or Instagram. Or,
Yeah, we'd love to see it.
yeah, it'd be great to hear from you. And as always, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Yeah, bye.
Frida. Smells the oysters.
Yeah, soup's done.
Hi, Frida. Frida, here. Here.